You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 10th of February 2025 on Monocle Radio.
It's 23:30 in Colombo, 1900 in Paris, 1800 here in London and 1300 in Montreal. That's the time on Monocle Radio, brought to you by Chanel Watches. An AI summit in Paris attempts to shut the door of regulation before the horse of innovation flees the stable. The far right gathers in triumph in Madrid, which is always a heartwarming spectacle, and the country plunged into darkness by a monkey. I'm Andrew Mueller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Mueller. My guests Murray and Giorgia Scaturro will discuss the day's big stories, and we'll meet the director of a hopefully not timely new series dramatising the life of Mussolini. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Mueller, and I am joined today by Giorgia Scaturro, London-based Italian reporter and producer, and Murray, Professor of Politics, Queen Mary University of London. Hello to you both.
Hello.
Rainbow, first of all, for fear that it may be the last time we can milk this, regular listeners will be aware that you are watching the 2024 Paris Olympic Games some months behind everybody else, and you're nearly there.
I'm nearly there. I always like to be well behind a trend, and I'm getting to the end of it. But I'm keeping it going by investing in new sports that I wouldn't normally watch, but that are fascinating. So I'm currently cheering on the right wing and the left wing and every other player of the Danish handball team.
Handball I've never quite grabbed the point of, and I am one of those people who watches the Olympics in more or less that way. I like to fixate on some sport I would never normally pay the least bit of attention to and get massively into it. It was sprint canoeing in Brazil. Paris was a bit trickier because we were actually there. But I think, whereabouts are you up to now? I don't want to do any spoilers.
I'm on the evening of the penultimate day.
Okay, so have you seen the women's water polo final yet?
Yes, that's one of the most recent things I've watched.
Yeah, Australia versus Spain. See, I was at
Yes.
that, and obviously, as you now know, it was a great disappointment to me and my fellow citizens, made more unbearable for me personally by the fact that I was sitting next to our New Zealander studio manager, David Stevens, who obviously was making more noise than any of the Spanish fans. Like,
but
really
Australia,
standing on his seat and shouting, "E viva España," there's no call for that.
Australia beat hot favourites USA to get to the final, so there's some consolation there, surely.
No. This is not how you are misunderstanding how Australians approach sport. Very much of the mind of Vincent Lombardi, for whom the Super Bowl trophy is named, who once said, "If winning isn't everything, why do they keep score?" Giorgia, you have been attempting to, inflame the excitement of your Italian audiences about the imminent visit of the King of England.
Yes, it's been announced last week that the King and the Queen will officially visit Italy, this time as monarchs, not at the Prince of Wales, on the 9th of April. And of course, being Italy in the equation, we started with a big dinner on Friday at Highgrove Gardens, where an Italian-inspired menu with locally sourced produce was served to distinguished guests coming from the world of eco-fashion. So
there's going to be several weeks of build-up before he actually gets on his plane.
Absolutely. Lots of news coming out of this. We're milking the royals. We love the royals in Italy. It's the most sublime distractions from everything else that's happening in the world.
What is the fascination? Because you are, of course, one of those countries that used to have a royal family and thought better of it some time ago.
Exactly. Our royals are somewhere now, apart from some appearances of them at the local Strictly Come Dancing. There's no much success of them in Italy left. So, yes, what about Kate and Camilla and all the drama? That keeps us entertained quite a lot.
Well, a big hello to any members of the Italian royal family and exile who may be listening, but we will start in Paris, the Grand Palais of which is currently hosting excited boffins and bewildered politicians for something grandly billed as the Artificial Intelligence Action Summit. The intention appears to be to resolve the essential tensions between tech companies and governments, specifically that tech companies would prefer much lighter regulation than to enable them to deliver an AI-powered future, whether anybody likes it, needs it, wants it or not, and that governments are worried that AI advances may lead to large-scale job losses, including, given the tendency of the unemployed to vote vengefully, their own. Rainbow, first of all, President Emmanuel Macron is there, Vice President J.D. Vance is going, so is China's Vice Premier Zhang Gaoqing. This is a pretty big deal, isn't it? I mean, this does suggest that these countries are trying to take this seriously.
This is a big deal. This is one of the main areas of competition at the moment on the international stage. We saw how China released their own AI model to rival that of the USA a couple of weeks ago, and that really unsettled the USA. Europe at the moment are a bit behind the race, but want to be in it. We're also seeing CEOs of some of the biggest tech companies in the world showing their faces at this event. So it's a big thing.
I mean, do we foresee this being the subject, I guess, Georgia, of, well, people are already worried about what tensions may arise in at least the next 4 years between the United States and Europe. Is this going to be the source of another of them? Because there is a line that the Americans are extremely fond of, to the effect that the United States innovates and then Europe regulates. And it is the case that Europe doesn't really have a major social media platform to call its own or a major tech player to call its own. Is this going to lead to more disagreement than agreement across the Atlantic?
Well, and I think this is one of the events in Paris where this issue will be dealt with. We know that Europe is lagging behind the rest of, especially the US and China, that are the leaders in this. 13% of European businesses use AI, and this is increasingly seen as a problem. So we've seen a shift from 2019 when the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, promised a legislation to deal with the human and ethical implications of AI, up to now when she virtually went to Paris saying that we need to compete. We need to use this in a way as a magic wand for economy to grow again and to attract investments. So what the European Union needs to be thinking now is how to harmonise the various regulations that they have in the digital sector, or the new AI Act, for instance, that is seen by many as posing again red tapes to a sector that needs to be flowing more to attract more investment and ultimately cure this big sick element, which is the economy.
Rainbow, even if the Europeans, though, do manage to come up with some sort of framework of regulation, is there any reason to expect that anybody else is going to sign up to it or adhere to it if they do? We are in what appears to be the early stages, for example, of the US state being gutted by a tech bro who doesn't think he should be regulated or made to obey the laws of man at all. And it just seems that this is going to be one of those arenas in which people who don't care about regulation and aren't interested in norms are actually going to be at a natural advantage.
Well, this is only actually the latest iteration in a long series of how do you regulate the internet and everything to do with it. So Europe has been trying for years to regulate big cyber companies, you know, the Amazons, Apples, Facebook, and now we're looking at artificial intelligence. But it's the same issue in that these are sort of global corporations. They are run on a global scale, and regulating it at a regional level is very difficult to achieve. And if you do achieve it, then what you're effectively doing is putting yourselves at a disadvantage relative to those who can go in gung-ho without having to adhere to ethical standards, because it's always quicker and cheaper to do something if you have no regard for the consequences. But of course, those consequences still exist. They're still real. And so I think what Europe has to do is try to impress upon the rest of the world that having a few safeguards isn't actually a terrible idea, whilst also trying not to apply so many of them that they put themselves at a huge competitive disadvantage.
It does remain to be seen whether anything in particular, Giorgia, will come of this summit. But before we move off this, I did want to ask you both in turn. I will ask you first to give us some benchmark of, well, your idea of how big a thing you think this is going to be, because I grant that I come at this as generally a sort of basically a technophobe. I don't think I even owned a mobile phone until about 2009. But I have a suspicion/hope that maybe AI is being somewhat oversold, and I'm only basing this on my own experiences of it. For example, in the spirit of idle curiosity, did once ask ChatGPT for some basic biographical details about myself, which are freely available, much to my irritation, and almost everything it regurgitated back at me was wrong.
Well, you'd be surprised to know that today, of all the days, I've asked ChatGPT whether we do need an international regulator. What can we help?
Good question.
Well, do you want to know the answer?
Go on.
Do you want to bet? Well, the answer was yes, we
Really?
do regulation. And he actually gave me some pretty cool reasonings about it. So it says, first of all, the main reason is because there's a global risk of misinformation and economic disruption, to which came to my mind recently, like as we speak, the Italian investigators are dealing with the case of funnily enough, Defense Minister Guido Crosetto, who purportedly had his voice mimicked by AI and making phone calls to the most important icons in Italy, like Giorgio Armani, Pirelli, and all the likes, asking for money to support hostages around the world, and they were scammed. I think this is one of the most extraordinary example of digital scam in our recent history. So, I mean, this could be taken into consideration when thinking about, you know, the dangers of AI as well.
And Rainbow, what about you? ChatGPT obviously having become the absolute bane of academia.
It is the bane of academia. Why write something original when you can get a bot to write it for you? But I think it actually plays into a much more fundamental risk that we already seem to be living in, to some extent, a post-truth society where it's becoming increasingly difficult to discern between truth and fiction, between reality and alternative reality. And so if we continue to have bots creating and disseminating and using algorithms to spread false information, it's going to be quite difficult for us to verify that it's false and to find an alternative version that's true if it's one bot's word against another. So once you take that human element out, it's not just the creative aspect. I think more fundamentally, it's about being able to discern between what's true and what's not. And that can be a very, very dangerous tool if one person has control of the narrative. If the CEO of a large tech company, like, for example, I don't know, Elon Musk, decides that this is what the version of the truth is going to be, and people don't have a way of counterfacting it.
Well, let's move along somewhat, for Paris is not the only European capital in the summit hosting racket at the moment. This past weekend, Madrid hosted the first major rally of Patriots for Europe, a new European Parliament grouping which sweeps up those European parties united by a dislike of foreigners. Aside from, it turns out, Elon Musk and his assistant Donald Trump, of whom they are very fond. Pledging themselves to the motto, "Make Europe Great Again," pause for listeners to groan. Such usual suspects as Viktor Orban, Marine Le Pen, Matteo Salvini and Geert Wilders vowed to do for and or to Europe what Musk and Trump are doing for and or to the United States. Giorgia, I wanted to ask you first, and not that I'm blaming you personally for anything, whether Trumpism, as we now understand it in America, really is or isn't importable to Europe. Because it has struck me before, and I know it's not an original observation, that very much a cue or a predecessor spiritually of Trump was, of course, Silvio Berlusconi, who came from a broadly similar background, ended up becoming president of Italy for a very long time, and was again one of those people who demonstrated that shamelessness is kind of a superpower. If you simply don't care about the rules, about norms, about conventions, you're kind of hard to bring down.
Absolutely. Well, you said Berlusconi, not blaming me, but I could turn it back to you and say Boris Johnson, for that matter.
Boris Johnson postdates Berlusconi, and besides which I'm Australian. I've got nothing to do with any of this.
Okay. No, but yes, I think the dangers that with this new era coming out, obviously the social media, the personalization of politics is really giving a weapon to the far right. And we've seen it. We've seen it in the UK with Nigel Farage. Mm-hmm. Now, the latest poll, if we had an election tomorrow, 25% of the population would vote for him. Mm-hmm. Similarly, Salvini, Giorgia Meloni, let's remember, Salvini is the vice prime mm-hmm. minister of Italy, together with Giorgia Meloni. They are enjoying a stable coalition of government that, like we haven't seen many of them in Italy, which means that the new Trump era can only galvanize this sort of far-right movements that have becoming the patrons of Europe, which we've seen in Spain at the weekend.
I mean, are the far-right at least in as much that, in their triumph, that is, Rainbow, at least in as much as they are having something of a moment? Obviously, their great patron has been reinstalled in the White House, but Herbert Kickl is about to become Chancellor of Austria. Polls generally glumly predict that Alternative for Deutschland will do quite well in Germany's election. But I feel like we've been saying, is the far right having a moment in Europe now for about 10 years?
I don't think the fact that we've been saying it for 10 years means it's not true, because we have seen very steady progress throughout those 10 years. We're not where we were 10 years ago. We're much further down the line. And we're still seeing countries that you didn't mention in that list, like France and the UK, where the far right are not in power, but getting ever closer to it. Mm-hmm. So I think the far right are having a moment. They are the strongest that they have been since the Second World War, and they now have a certain amount of strength in numbers, which we haven't seen previously. And I think one thing also that has changed is it's not just that the far-right parties themselves are on the ascendant, but the messages that they are giving out are now being increasingly incorporated into the political mainstream by other parties, which makes the far-right more credible, and it means that they win even when they don't.
But I think it's not the far right's becoming stronger, but it's also the European Union not learning from this past 10 years. And I think we are really at a crunch time where the EU needs to decide to become a less frustrating project when it comes to bureaucracies, regulations that are fueling the criticism from the patriots and the right. So bureaucracies, immigration, which is also kind of a controversial patchy policy in Europe. So I think we are now at the very crunch moment for the whole EU project.
Just before we move off this, Rainbow, and it's by way of pivoting to the next item, because this will also come up. I don't disagree with anything Giorgia said there, but how is that practically possible? Because even if you go out as what we might think of as a sensible centrist technocrat and attempt to address the concerns which are fueling the far right, and you can say, OK, we should take a look at immigration. We should do something about that. We should, we should enforce the rules better. We should make the rules more stringent, etc., etc. But this is difficult and complicated. It will take time, etc., which is true because everything is complicated and difficult and does take time. Whereas the far right will just say vote for us, there won't be any more foreigners and free beer will come out of the taps.
Well, actually, that is one aspect where being in power might, funnily enough, take the sting out of their tail, because it's very easy to promise simple solutions when you're in opposition. And all that the far right ever have is simplistic solutions. They don't do complexity.
No.
They don't do reality. They don't deal with the long time scales and the budgetary issues and the complexity of real life. So when you put them in power and they have to deal with those things because people in power have to confront reality, they often come up short. So it can be perhaps challenging for them to come true on the promises that they make when actually being put into power. But of course, to get that far, you would actually have to have an experiment with them in power, which is what we're now witnessing in the USA with all its consequences.
Well, to broaden that topic out somewhat, it is not only far-right populist yahoos who are seeking to absorb the lessons of the Trump restoration. Those lessons being, apparently, that a plurality of the electorate will happily overlook more or less any defects in a candidate or party who amuses them and or articulates their prejudices, informed or otherwise. The UK's governing Labour Party had an outing last Friday to discuss explaining themselves via video clips on TikTok and Instagram, the idea apparently being that voters are prone to being bewildered by facts, statistics and so forth, but respond positively to flashing lights and bright colours. Giorgia, is this going to work? Can what we might think of as the establishment parties actually reach those susceptible to the populists by attempting to communicate at this level?
It's not me, it's the statistics. People from the Labour Party themselves say, no, it's not going to work. I mean, yes, you are showing facts, 600 immigration arrests going up 73% from last year, 48% in raids, trying to calm down the population, but it's not going to work the way they want to work. People need to see results at this point. That's why we had the Home Office coming out and saying we're working with partners in Europe so that we are enforcing the rules of cracking down on immigrants, but the image that they are putting out can only somehow inflame the topic until we see a clear resolution. And unfortunately, we still have in our eyes images from last July, end of July, when the riots started. So it's a double-bladed... it's a double blade.
I mean, there's a problem, though, as well, I think, Rainbow, and it's an eternal, universal one, that people tend to judge actions by reputation rather than the other way around. For example, Joe Biden, during his one term in the first 2 years of his presidency, deported 4.4 million people from the United States versus 3.13 million across Donald Trump's entire first term. Joe Biden was a much, much more enthusiastic deporter than Trump, and Obama was no slouch on this either, and yet the Democrats keep getting beaten up successfully for being soft touchers on immigration.
Yes, and again, it's that question of reality and how you frame reality, and that often people who want to win on the immigration game will talk the talk rather than necessarily walk the walk. And one of the reasons for that is that walking the walk isn't necessarily about immigrant bashing or about these flamboyant displays of cuffing foreigners and whisking them off to the airport. Some things that work more effectively can be things like voluntary deportations, where you give people good incentives to come to you and say, well, maybe you'd be happier somewhere else. Whereas if you say, right, we're going to come for you and your kids, and we're going to publicly humiliate you and then send you away, what do people do? They go underground. Not literally, but they hide from authorities, and then it becomes much more difficult to do. So a carrot can often be more effective than a stick, but voters don't understand the carrots. They don't understand the positive incentives.
But in terms of the communications, though, Giorgia, is this inevitable? Do politicians and political parties have no choice but to do this? If we reach a point where most voters don't read serious newspapers, don't listen to serious broadcast media, and really do just grab their understanding of things through whatever brisk morsels are flung up on their phone screens?
Well, I think you should ask this question to Elon Musk, which is basically what has become, unfortunately, the social media, the video. We communicate communicate through what we see, and hence this sort of video, these sort of images, the chains, the deported with their hands tied, and it's up to us now to just break this cycle. What do we do? Is the question. Do we stop going on X? Do we stop watching these videos? Do we vote for leaders who choose to have different tools? But what tools? I think we were at times that are confusing for people who are eager to have the right information that they can't find it there. Definitely a video is not the way to educate an electorate.
Just finally on this, Rainbow, and this is arrant wishful thinking on my part. I've always thought that it goes badly for politicians when they attempt to engage in a realm in which they just look inauthentic. Like when you get sort of generic middle-aged politician who's clearly been fed a line by one of his younger advisors saying, yes, I'm very fond of that pop group that all the young people are into. I mean, no, they're not, and everybody knows that. Would there be anything to be gained by a politician, for example, a serious, somewhat stolid middle-aged technocrat like Sir Keir Starmer, just being asked about Instagram, TikTok, etc., and just saying, God, it all looks absolutely ghastly. I don't understand any of it, and I'm not going to do it.
I think a lot of people of a certain generation would go, yeah, I hear you. But I think, sort of bringing all these themes back together, I think populism thrives on sound bites, on short snippets of misinformation that don't add up. And so a platform like TikTok is perfect for populism because, it doesn't go into any depth, it doesn't unpick arguments, it doesn't necessarily have a sort of clear relationship with reality. So I think if you try to engage with that when that's not your natural domain, you're going to perhaps reach a wider audience, but you're not necessarily going to convince them of anything. And we have in political science what we call issue ownership, that different parties are positively associated with certain policies. If you try and stray onto an issue that you don't own, all you'll do is remind voters that that's something they care about and that they like the other party more on that issue. So it's very dangerous territory trying to outdo your opponents on their own turf.
Well, and to a story now about a monkey, included, if we're honest, mostly for who doesn't like stories about monkeys reasons, but with the vague hope that it may serve as a usefully humbling reminder of the degree to which humanity remains, for all its innovative genius, at the mercy of the natural world. Yesterday, an entire country, Sri Lanka to be specific, lost power for several hours due to an as yet unspecified interaction between a substation and a macaque. Obviously, Giorgia, the entire energy grid of a country being vulnerable to a lone monkey does seem like the sort of thing which shouldn't happen, and I do hope Sri Lankan authorities are looking into this. But we wanted to ask you both, have you ever been sensationally inconvenienced by some intervention by the wildlife?
Yes, I have. I don't know about you, but if I can start, the mighty squirrel has chewed my window, my roof, to the point that it made a hole trying to gather access.
You're not feeding them enough.
Possibly, but this whole anxiety about squirrels led me to check online, only to find that there is a list called cyber squirrel, which apparently they are on top of monkey. If monkey has caused 12 disturbances, the squirrels have caused 1,252, only followed by birds, snakes, raccoon, and, mind me, jellyfish. Jellyfish seem to be the most danger to nuclear plants. And,
how's a jellyfish getting into a nuclear plant?
Well, apparently they clog the filters of nuclear plants.
This isn't like 8 jellyfish in a trench coat. Sort of trying to sneak in as, I don't know, whoever would wear a trench coat into a nuclear plant.
Well, the image is quite romantic, but yeah, I mean, it's something that we need to be on the lookout, considering that Keir Starmer has put all this emphasis in nuclear plants these days.
See, I have issues with squirrels attempting to eat any fruit I may attempt to grow in my garden, but they haven't started eating my house that I've noticed.
Trust me, it's not a good place to be.
Well, then maybe plant an apple tree as a diversion. Perhaps that's what I've done and just didn't realise it. I've sorted out squirrels. Rainbow, what about you? Have you been... I mean, obviously, coming from Australia as I do, I've got hours of material on this, mostly being either kept awake at night by possums running around in the roof or woken up far too early by kookaburras on the windowsill, which is... That's a rousing wake-up call, that one. But what about you?
I've had squirrels digging up all our plants in the garden. I probably don't have any stories as good as Georgia. But I think actually this also kind of links the stories back together again. When you're thinking about AI, one of the problems with it is that it is hugely energy demanding. Mm-hmm. So you have to invest huge amounts of energy when we're in the middle of a climate crisis. And then if you look at what the far right is suggesting, one of their big policies is let's tear up all of the environmental policies, let's deny that climate change is happening and throw it all out of the window. Drill, baby, drill. But actually, if you mess with nature, it's going to come back and bite you on the bum.
On your electric grid.
Yes.
Well, on that upbeat note, Rainbow Murray and Giorgia Scaturro, thank you for joining us. Finally, on today's show, the English director and producer Joe Wright is no stranger to historical epics, but his new series is both bigger and more provocative than perhaps anything he has done before. Mussolini, Son of the Century, based on the acclaimed historical novel by Antonio Scarlatti, is a creative, loud and unabashed exploration of Italian fascism through the lens of its absurd patriarch. Monocle's deputy head of radio, Tom Webb, sat down with Wright and began by asking why he decided to take this story on.
I remember a kid, a mate of mine, when I was probably about 14, and he was getting an education, whereas I wasn't. And he had just learnt about Mussolini, and he was doing these impersonations of this kind of character, and we were all very entertained. And around the same sort of time, we started going on CND marches and Red Wedge gigs and stuff like that. And fascism became this kind of pejorative term you'd throw at people in authority. Police were fascists and the teachers at school were definitely fascists. And none of us, I don't think, really understood what the word meant. And then with the rise of the far right and the populist far right across the world, I felt it was incumbent upon me to try and understand what that word meant. And so that was really to educate myself. But every film I do is a matter of educating myself, really.
And it is complicated. I would agree. I studied Mussolini at school and I could never get my head around his relationship with socialism. And yet in this film, you absolutely nail it perfectly. How did you work with historical text to really get that script as fine as it is?
Well, the book, Antonio Scarlatti's book, is monumental, really. And it's all in there, from the facts to, in a way, also the aesthetic. It combines text, newspaper articles, fictional scenes, telegrams. And so this collage effect, almost a kind of cubist collage effect, was what we then brought into the aesthetics of the piece. Being in Italy for 2 years meant that I was talking to a lot of people constantly about Mussolini and his time and also his legacy, from, taxi drivers to academics. And that was really important across the country as well. Italy never really dealt with its fascist past. And there was no Nuremberg trial, there was no truth and reconciliation. After the war, they just kind of almost pretended it hadn't happened. There were some horrific retributions laid out against fascist individuals being hung up from lampposts and so on, but they never really dealt with it as a society. And there have been very few pieces, film, television, about Mussolini in Italy. So it's very much an alive topic there. Everyone has an opinion and everyone is very interested in engaging in conversation about him.
And how was it working in Italian, creating an Italian production?
I've loved Italian cinema since I was a teenager, really. I mean, Scorsese's Taxi Driver, opened up a whole new world of filmmaking for me. I saw it when I was 15, and in one summer I think I must have watched it 56 times. And so through Scorsese and the Italian-American directors, I found my way back to Italy, and I have a particular love of Visconti, though of course, Fellini and so on. So it was a huge deal for me to go to Italy, and not just Italy, but to go to Cinecittà, where so many of those films were made, and work there. And I'd made Cyrano in Sicily during the pandemic, so I'd worked with a lot of Italian crew, and a lot of those crew came on to Mussolini as well. Working in a language that I don't really speak was kind of fascinating, really. I mean, obviously I had, the Italian script and the English script next to each other, the translation, and I could refer back and forth, and I had language advisors with me. But the Italian performance style is so gestural, in a way, acting across the nations has different heritages. English acting is very much about text. American acting is very much about psychotherapy. Italian acting is all about, commedia dell'arte and the performance. Most of the great Italian actors come from Naples, where the streets are a theatre. So Italian actors, you can kind of tell whether they're being honest or not by the sounds, the tunes they make, and the gestures, and it was a really fascinating experiment.
That was Monocle's Tom Webb speaking to the director Joe Wright. Mussolini, Son of the Century, is available to stream now. That is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Rainbow Murray and Giorgia Scaturro. Today's show was produced by Vincent McAvaney and researched by Gunnar Gronlid and Maisie Ringer. Our sound engineer was Flynn Simons. I'm Andrew Mueller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.